The morning air was sharp with a scent of pine sap and smoke from hearths rising faintly through the valley. Abigail Turner tugged her shawl tighter across her shoulders as she stepped carefully through the frosted undergrowth, the wicker basket on her arm already half filled with fallen branches. It was late November, and wood was as precious as coin in her family's cabin. Her father's rheumatism left much of the gathering to her, and with the cold creeping deeper each night, she could not risk returning empty-handed. She moved with practiced caution. The war had reached even these quiet New England hills. British patrols had ridden through just weeks before, shaking down farmers for grain, accusing every able-bodied man of treason. Loyalist neighbors had grown bold too, whispering threats and keeping their eyes open for anyone suspected of helping the rebels. Abigail had learned to walk lightly, to keep her ears sharp for the crack of musket or the jangle of horse tackle. But this morning seemed still, the woods hushed except for the crunch of her shoes over frozen leaves. She bent to gather a crooked branch, testing its weight before sliding it into her basket. Her breath clouded white as she straightened, brushing a strand of brown hair from her cheek. The sun had barely lifted over the ridgeline, casting pale beams through the trees. She intended to be home before it climbed higher. Her mother worried when she lingered, but as Abigail turned deeper into the thicket, she paused. A sound broke the silence, faint but unmistakable, a groan. Her body stiffened. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see a redcoat emerging from the brush. Instead, the groan came again, low and ragged, from somewhere ahead. Against every instinct screaming at her to retreat, she pressed forward, her steps muffled over the needles. At last she pushed aside a curtain of birch branches and froze. A man lay sprawled on the ground near a mossed rock, his coat torn and darkened with blood. His face was pale, the jaw shadowed with several days' growth of beard, his eyes half-lidded. A musket rested abandoned nearby, its strap tangled with the roots. For a moment Abigail thought he might already be dead, until he stirred weakly and his gaze found her. "Pray," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Hide me." Abigail's heart slammed in her chest. She stood rooted, clutching the handle of her basket until her knuckles ached. Every tale she had heard of deserters, spies, and hunted men flared in her mind. To be caught harboring such a stranger would invite ruin on her family. And yet, to leave him here, bleeding into the cold earth, was to let a man die before her very eyes. She crouched cautiously beside him. "Sir," she whispered, her breath quick. "Who are you? What happened?" The man's eyes fluttered. His coat was not red but a worn blue, the color of the Continental line, though dulled by mud and blood. His shirt was torn near the shoulder, a gash seeping crimson through hastily knotted cloth. He swallowed with effort. "Ambushed dragoons. They pursue me still." His hand trembled as he reached toward the satchel strapped across his chest. Must not fall into their hands. Abigail's gaze flicked to the trees, the silence suddenly oppressive. British dragoons. If they were near, the woods might already be crawling with them. She could almost hear the phantom echo of hooves on the frozen ground. Her pulse raced. She should run, leave this man and his peril behind. But then his eyes, dark and fever-bright, fixed on hers with a pleading that went deeper than words. "Please," he whispered, "if you have mercy, hide me." Her breath caught in her throat. She thought of her father, hunched by the fire, hands too stiff to hold an axe. She thought of her younger brother Thomas, only 12, who still believed war was some distant thundercloud. If she brought this man home, she would drag that thundercloud into their very door. Yet the stranger's blood stained the frosted grass, proof enough that he would not survive without aid. Abigail chewed her lip, torn between fear and conscience. "Can you walk?" she asked softly. The man grimaced, attempting to push himself up on one elbow, but his strength failed and he collapsed back with a gasp. "A few steps, no more. They must not find me." Her basket lay forgotten on the ground as she weighed the impossible choice. To help him was to invite danger. To abandon him was to live forever with the knowledge that she had turned her back on a dying man. She thought of the sermons her mother clung to, that charity and courage marked the true heart of faith. Abigail's pulse hammered as she slipped the strap of his satchel over her own shoulder. "Then you'll lean on me," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "We must move quickly." The stranger's lips curved faintly, as though her resolve surprised him. With effort he staggered upright, one arm heavy across her shoulders. Abigail braced herself, nearly buckling under his weight, but she tightened her grip and urged him forward. Each step was a struggle, his breath harsh in her ear. The woods seemed alive with imagined pursuit, every snapping twig a musket cocking, every gust of wind a horse's snort. At last, after what felt an eternity though it was but minutes, they reached the edge of the thicket where the path sloped toward the Turner cabin. Abigail's heart lurched as she glimpsed movement on the ridge, a glint of sunlight on metal. Voices carried faintly through the trees, sharp and commanding. "British patrol." Her throat went dry. They were closer than she had feared. The stranger stiffened at the sound, his body tensing against hers. "They come," he hissed. Abigail's mind raced. The cabin was still 100 yards off, too far if the patrol descended. To drag him openly down the slope was to invite discovery. Her gaze darted to a cluster of boulders half hidden by brush. With renewed urgency she guided him there, stumbling beneath his weight. They collapsed into the shadowed hollow just as the thud of hooves echoed along the ridge. Abigail pressed herself flat, the stranger gasping softly beside her. Through the branches she saw them, 3 dragoons in scarlet coats, their horses snorting plumes into the cold air. They scanned the woods, muskets ready, one officer barking orders. Abigail's stomach clenched so tightly it hurt. She dared not breathe. The stranger's blood dripped onto her sleeve, warm against the freezing air. For a long moment time hung suspended, the patrol lingering on the ridge. Then with a shout they spurred their mounts downslope, toward the valley, away from the hollow where Abigail crouched. She waited until their hoofbeats faded before releasing the breath she had been holding. Her hands trembled violently as she wiped them on her skirt. The stranger's eyes met hers, gratitude and exhaustion mingling in his expression. "You saved me," he murmured. Abigail swallowed hard, her pulse still racing. She had not yet saved him, merely postponed the moment of reckoning. Already she knew there was no turning back. She had chosen, in that instant in the woods, to bind her fate to his. And as she helped him rise again, guiding him toward the hidden path that led to her family's cabin, she felt the weight of that choice settle heavy on her shoulders. The war, once a distant storm, had come to her door, and she had opened it. The hidden path from the thicket to the Turner cabin ran along a shallow swale where rainwater gathered in spring. Abigail knew each root and stone by memory. With the stranger's arm cinched over her shoulders, she half guided, half dragged him down the depression, pausing whenever his breath hitched into a ragged cough. Twice he stumbled, and twice she clutched him harder, teeth clenched against the cold ache flooding her arms. When the roofline of the cabin finally appeared between black spruce boughs, relief surged through her so sharply she tasted it. "Wait," she whispered, easing him against an oak. She tore a low pine bough free and swept the ground behind them in quick, brutal arches, blurring their tracks on the frosted duff. She doubled back once, an old woodcutter's trick her father had taught her, then returned to him, lungs burning. A shout drifted from the ridge, faint but angry. There was no more time to be clever. "Lean hard," she said. "We're nearly there." They slipped behind the shed and pressed up to the cabin's back door, a rough planked thing with a splintered latch. Abigail nudged it with her hip and the room's warmth met them like a breath. The low pop of the hearth, the smell of boiled oats and smoke and iron. Her mother, Mary Turner, turned from the pot with a wooden spoon in hand and a rebuke already forming on her lips for Abigail's lateness. The rebuke died when she saw the man. "Merciful Lord," Mary whispered. From the settle near the hearth, Abigail's father looked up. Silas Turner's beard had gone more gray than black in the last year, and the rheumatism that coiled in his knuckles made the most basic tasks slow. But his eyes were clear. He shifted forward, pain creasing his brow. "Shut the door, Abby," he said evenly. "And pull the bar." Abigail obeyed, lowering the bolt. The stranger swayed, the color stripping from his face. "Spare room," he managed. Mary's hand trembled as she pointed. "Cellar," Silas corrected, nodding toward the hand-hewn trap near the table. "Until we know who hunts him." He stared at the blue of the man's tattered coat and the satchel slung across Abigail's shoulder. "And who he is?" "Isaac Merrick," the stranger said, swaying. "Courier." He swallowed, fighting for the next word. "Continental." Silas's jaw worked, thinking. "Abby." "British Dragoons," she said, voice low. "On the ridge." They were searching. Mary crossed herself. Then, catching herself, old habits borrowed from their Irish neighbor. She gripped a cloth and set a kettle near the coals. "Thomas," she hissed toward the small bedchamber. "Thomas, stay inside." A mop of hair appeared in the doorway, her 12-year-old brother's eyes wide. "Abby." "It's all right," she lied. "Not a word, Tom." Together, Silas and Abigail got Isaac to the trapdoor. Silas lifted the ring with a grunt, revealing the cool black mouth of the root cellar, air damp with earth, potatoes, and old apples. Isaac balked at the steps, jaw clenching as pain broke across his face. "I can manage," he said, and failed. They half carried him down anyway, step by step, until he sank against a barrel in the shadowed corner. Abigail unwound the makeshift bandage from his shoulder. Blood had glued linen to skin. He hissed as she soaked it free with warm water. The gash was ugly, slashed by a saber or torn by a ball that had furrowed flesh and missed bone by Providence alone. She pressed clean rags against it until the seep slowed. "We've honey," Mary called softly down the steps. "And vinegar." Abigail nodded. "Honey first," she said. "It keeps rot away." She smeared the thick amber over the wound and bound it with fresh strips torn from a worn sheet. When her fingers shook, she pressed them flat against her dress until they steadied. Isaac watched her work without speaking, teeth gritted, sweat glinting on his brow despite the chill. "Code in the satchel," he muttered finally, voice thready. "Numbers. If they demand it, say it is flour." Silas's gaze cut to the satchel now lying by the cellar steps. "They'll not ask for flour by number," he said, tone dry. He crouched, painfully, and slid the satchel under a false board he'd fitted years before, a hidey hole for candles and the last of the good tobacco. "They'll ask for men," he added, meeting Isaac's eyes. "Names of men who'll hang." Footsteps creaked above. Thomas, obeying the order to stay inside but unable not to skulk by the trap to listen. Abigail took the kettle Mary lowered on a rope and poured a washbowl half full, the steam a ghost in the cellared gloom. She rinsed Isaac's hands, then his face. He sighed, the sigh of a man briefly permitted to imagine comfort. When she crouched to examine the wound again, she saw the fever rising already, a flush shading his cheekbones. "You'll drink willowbark tea," she told him. "And you'll stay quiet." "Quiet I can manage." He tried a smile and failed. "I owe you a debt already, miss." "Abigail Turner," she said. "Abby to Thomas. Abigail to everyone else." "Miss Turner," he said, with the kind of weary dignity that made her cheeks heat for no good reason. "You've courage." She set her mouth. Courage felt like fear stretched thin and pressed into shape. "Save your praise," she said, and tightened the knot on his bandage. Upstairs, the house fell into a careful, unnatural rhythm. Mary cleaned the blood from the floorboards with a scrub of hot water and lye. She aired the room, then shut the shutters to slits, lest watchful eyes see too much. Thomas peeled potatoes, each scrape a small shriek on the knife, while Silas sawed kindling in the shed with grim, steady strokes that covered a world of worry. Abigail ground willow bark with a pestle and brewed a bitter tea that Isaac drank in small, determined sips, his forehead cooling under a cloth. By mid-afternoon clouds had thickened, promising either snow or sleet. The light inside the cabin grew greenish and dim. Hiram Cobb arrived first, as Abigail feared he might. Hiram prided himself on knowing every morsel of news before it had finished happening. He stamped the frost from his boots on the stoop and rapped the door with gloved knuckles, too hard. Mary met him with a thin smile. "Hiram." "Mrs. Turner," he said, removing his hat but not his suspicion. "Saw riders on the ridge. Redcoats looked like. They say a rebel courier slipped past them overnight. Did you hear anything?" His gaze skittered past her shoulder into the room, counting chairs, counting cups, measuring shadows. Abigail's breath thinned. A single rust-brown smear she'd missed glowed at the baseboard, small as a penny. Before Hiram's roving eyes could drop to it, she stepped forward with a ladle. "We've stew, Mr. Cobb," she said, forcing casualness. "Potatoes and a bit of pork. Will you take a bowl? It'll warm you better than gossip." He grinned without mirth. "I never refuse a kindness." He stepped in, bringing his appetite and his curiosity. He sat, ate, spoke of feed prices and wintergrain, and then circled back to the only thing that interested him. "They're paying bounties again," he noted, voice too light. "For those who give aid to the crown. A small farm might find a windfall that way." Silas, coming in from the shed with sawdust on his sleeves, shut the door behind him with quiet finality. "And a small farm might find itself without neighbors if it made a habit of it," he said mildly. "Men remember who takes their coin." Hiram's smile slipped. He ate faster. Above his words, Abigail could hear a faint creak below the floor, a shift of weight as Isaac settled, or the wooden murmur a cellar made when the frost eased. She put her heel hard on the trap seam and looked Hiram in the eye until he looked away. When he finally stood, wiping the bowl with bread, he left with a clumsy benediction about staying safe and an even clumsier glance toward the shed where the Turners kept their old mare. "He'll spread your stew across the county by supper time," Silas muttered, bolting the door. "Let him," Mary said, lifting the wash basin with shaking hands. "So long as he spreads nothing else." Late afternoon sagged into evening. Isaac's fever climbed, then broke in a wash of sweat that left him shivering. He slept fitfully, mumbling half-words. Bridge, 2 days, Hudson, that Abigail did not understand but tucked away, the way one collects kindling against a future fire. Twice she changed the bandage. Twice she felt her own stomach knot at the sight of blood that kept finding its way to daylight. The second knock came after dark and did not belong to a neighbor. It rolled through the house like a drumbeat. Rap, 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 official and heavy. Thomas flinched so hard his spoon struck his bowl. Mary's eyes met Abigail's. No one breathed. Silas stood, his joints making their own old man knock. He set his jaw, lifted the latch, and opened the door onto a spill of torchlight and 3 red coats slicked with sleet. "Good evening," the officer said, the greeting stripped of warmth. Water ran from the brim of his hat. 2 dragoons loomed behind him, muskets cradled at ready. "Lieutenant Wallace, King's Dragoons. We pursue a rebel courier, wounded, believed to have fled into these woods. Permission to enter and search your premises." Silas took his cap off and held it against his chest, a gesture of respect old enough to be instinct. "We are loyal to peace, Lieutenant," he said carefully. "You're welcome to look, within reason." The lieutenant smiled a professional smile, the kind a man learns when paid to step into other men's homes. "Reason is an amiable thing," he said, and stepped across the threshold without waiting for a further invitation. They moved with efficient curiosity, eyes sweeping corners, hands brushing curtains and doorframes. One dragged the hearth screen back and looked into the coals as if a courier might be simmering there. Another thumped the bed frames with a bayonet. Lieutenant Wallace paused at the table, eyes falling to the damp floorboards. "You've washed recently," he observed. "My boy spilled stew," Mary said, quiet as prayer. "Mostly on the table," Thomas added in a brave, small voice. The lieutenant crouched, ran a finger along a seam between the boards, and then straightened, gaze locking for a heartbeat on the iron ring set into the trap near Abigail's heel. He walked toward it, the room narrowing with each step. Abigail felt the pound of her pulse in the tender place beneath her ear. Isaac lay not 20 inches below her, separated by nothing sturdier than old pine and a latch. Before the lieutenant could reach the trap, a clink sounded from the shed. The mare's halter chain rattled sharply, then again. It might have been the wind. It might have been a salvation. All 3 soldiers turned in the same instant, the lieutenant's eyebrow lifting. What was that? Wind loosening a poorly hung door, Silas said without missing a beat. She blows hard from the east in November. Lieutenant Wallace considered. A drop of sleet slid from his hat brim and broke on the floor in a tiny star. Open it, he told one of the men, nodding toward the back door. The dragoon shouldered his musket and strode outside, boots cracking on the frosted stoop. The second followed. Only the lieutenant remained, eyes drifting back, inevitably, to the iron ring at Abigail's heel. He reached for it. Abigail stamped her heel down as if to scratch an itch, skin tingling where iron met leather. At that exact moment a shout split the night from the shed. A curse, a scramble, the clatter of a fallen bucket, and the frantic thud of hooves. The mare screamed her indignation. The lieutenant's head snapped up. He pivoted toward the door, hand dropping from the ring. "Hold there!" he barked and strode outside into the sleet and torchlight, musket barrels following. Abigail stood frozen, breath locked, the house suddenly vast with silence but for the rapid drum of her own heart. She looked at her father. His face had gone the color of paper, but his eyes still burned. "Abby," he said, barely audible, as the door swung wide and the night swallowed the soldiers. "For the love of God, be quick!" Because in the cellar below, something scraped against wood, a body shifting or a satchel nudged from its hiding place, and she knew with dreadful clarity that the reprieve would be measured in seconds. The moment the soldiers left, silence swallowed the cabin. Only the mare's restless stomping carried through the night, a dull rhythm against the boards. Abigail stood rooted to the trapdoor, her palm pressed flat against her skirts to still the trembling of her hand. The iron ring seemed to glow in the firelight, a reminder of how thin the line was between safety and ruin. Her father leaned heavy on his cane, face pale. "They'll be back," he said. His voice was steady, but beneath it she heard the ache of certainty. "They don't leave questions unanswered." Mary gathered the bowls from the table with jerky motions, her knuckles white. "Then what do we do, Silas?" "Hide a soldier in our cellar while redcoats camp the ridge. We'll bring a noose on our necks, every one of us." Thomas, wide-eyed, clutched the hearth poker like a weapon. "We can fight them," he blurted, though his voice broke halfway. "If they come back." Silas shook his head. "Steel against 3 dragoons is one thing. Steel against the weight of the crown is another. They'll not hang a boy for bravado. They'll burn us out for treason." Abigail swallowed, throat tight. "And if we cast him out now? He's half dead. That's no different than killing him ourselves." Her words hung like smoke. Mary's lips pressed thin, but she said nothing. Silas's gaze moved to the trap, then to his daughter. "You brought him here, Abby. You've tied us to his fate. Don't mistake me. I don't say it to condemn. But you must understand, the choice is made. What follows is consequence." Abigail lowered her eyes. She felt the truth of it deep in her bones. Down in the cellar, Isaac Marek stirred fitfully. When Abigail descended, carrying a bowl of broth, she found him fever-slick, his shirt clinging to his chest, his breath shallow. The bandage was already darkened. She set the bowl aside and sponged his forehead, coaxing him to swallow a few sips of bitter willow tea. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "You should not risk," he murmured. "Your family. Save your strength," she said. "I've seen farms razed," he rasped. "Neighbors dragged out. They don't forget a kindness to men like me. You'll be marked." Abigail's chest tightened. "Then live long enough to make it worth the mark," she said quietly. For the first time his gaze sharpened. A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed his face. He nodded faintly, then closed his eyes again. The next day dawned raw and grey, sleet slanting against the shutters. Abigail spent the morning splitting what little would remain dry, each strike of the hatchet echoing her unease. She thought constantly of the patrol. If they discovered Isaac, their lives would end in ruin. If they betrayed him, perhaps they would survive. But survival built on cowardice felt like another kind of death. By noon, word traveled down the valley. The dragoons had searched 2 homesteads, overturning barrels and ripping apart haylofts. At the Cobb farm, they had confiscated grain and left the family with little but bitterness. Hiram himself stopped by the Turner place, leaning too easily on the fence, his eyes quick and hungry. "They say he's a courier," Hiram said, voice dripping with false casualness. "Carries papers worth a fortune in bounty. The kind of fortune that might mend a rheumatic man's farm." Abigail stiffened. "Do you mean to sell your neighbors, Hiram?" He shrugged, smirking. "I mean to keep my own hearth warm. What you do with yours is your choice." His gaze lingered a beat too long on the cabin door before he tipped his hat and ambled off, leaving behind a trail of suspicion heavier than footprints. Mary turned on Abigail the moment the man was gone. "Do you see now?" she whispered fiercely. "The whole valley knows. If Hiram suspects, he'll whisper it where it pays. We cannot shelter this man another day." Abigail wanted to answer, but her father's raised hand stilled both of them. "Hiram Cobb's tongue is a noose for us all," Silas said. "But we'll not let him be the measure of our mercy." That night, Abigail crept to the cellar again. Isaac was awake, sitting against the wall, his face shadowed but his eyes alert. "They'll come again," he said before she spoke. "Your neighbor is the kind who trades men's lives for a coin. I've seen the type in every village from the Hudson to the Delaware." "You've seen much," she said, sitting beside him on the dirt floor. "Too much," he admitted, then shifted, wincing. "I've carried dispatches through 3 winters. Some were worthless, scraps to confuse the enemy. Others held plans men bled to protect. This," he tapped his satchel, "could change the tide. If I fail, an entire brigade marches blind." Abigail studied him, the weight of his words pressing heavily. "And if you succeed? Then perhaps the war ends sooner. Perhaps fewer sons never come home." Her throat closed around the thought of Thomas, her little brother with hands too small for a musket. She looked down at her calloused fingers. "I'll see you safe," she said before she could second-guess it. Isaac gave her a long look. "You already risked all you have." "Why?" She hesitated. Then, with quiet honesty, she said, "Because if I turned away, I wouldn't know myself anymore." For a long time he said nothing. Finally, he gave a slight nod, as though the answer satisfied something he had not known he was asking. The following evening, danger came knocking again. This time it was no soldier but Ruth Ellis, a widow from half a mile down the track. She came with a basket of eggs and a wary eye. "Strange times," she murmured, standing on the threshold. "They say the dragoons will burn out anyone caught harboring a rebel. I thought to warn you." Mary accepted the basket with a stiff smile, but Ruth's gaze swept the room with sharp intuition. Abigail held her breath, praying the woman would not notice the faint scent of vinegar and honey still lingering from the wound dressings. Ruth leaned closer, her voice low. "If you're keeping someone, be careful. My eldest saw torchlight near the ridge last night. They'll not stop searching." Then she was gone, leaving the warning like a stone in Abigail's stomach. That night, as Abigail lay awake on her straw mattress, the decision crystallized. Isaac could not remain hidden here. Each passing hour tightened the noose around her family. Yet turning him out in his state was a sentence of death. There was only one path. She must move him herself, find a way to smuggle him past the dragoons, past men like Hiram Cobb, and into safe hands further north. The very thought left her trembling. She had never traveled beyond the valley alone. She was no soldier, no spy. And yet, who else would do it? She rose before dawn, the world still black and brittle with cold. She wrapped bread and cheese in cloth, filled a flask with water, and stowed them in a small sack. In the cellar, Isaac watched her preparations with wary eyes. "You mean to move me," he said. "We've no choice," she whispered. "If you stay, we'll all hang. If you leave, perhaps you live. Perhaps we all do." He exhaled slowly. "You're braver than I deserve." She looked him squarely in the eye. "This isn't about what you deserve. It's about what I can't bear not to do." Footsteps creaked above, the stir of her father rising. Abigail's time was gone. She pressed the bundle into Isaac's lap, her resolve hard as the frost outside. "We leave tonight," she said. And in that moment, she understood her father's words. The choice had been made in the forest, when she first bent to a bleeding man. Now came the consequence, the path that would change all of their lives. The night came heavy with sleet, the wind rattling the shutters like a warning. Abigail lay awake, listening to every groan of timber and whip of icy branches. The bundle she had prepared sat ready by her bed, its weight more than bread and cloth. It was the weight of decision, of lives balanced on her courage. When at last the household settled into uneasy sleep, she rose, pulled on her thickest cloak, and lifted the cellar trapdoor. Isaac stirred in the dim light of her lantern. His face was pale but clearer, fever-broken, though weakness still clung to him like a second skin. "It's time," she whispered. He nodded, struggling upright. Every movement cost him effort, but he masked it with determination. She slipped the satchel over her shoulder, adjusted her bundle, and helped him climb the rough steps. The cabin was hushed, fire embers glowing faintly in the hearth. Abigail paused, looking once toward the shadow of her father's chamber door. She could almost hear his voice. "The choice is made. What follows is consequence." They slipped out into the night. The world was silver with frost, each branch coated, the ground hard as stone. Abigail guided Isaac along the rear of the shed, careful to keep to the hollowed track where hooves rarely touched. The woods swallowed them quickly, the lantern hidden beneath her cloak. Each step cracked faintly, and every sound felt amplified in the frozen stillness. Isaac leaned heavily, but he kept his jaw tight. "North," he murmured. "There's a mill 3 miles up the creek," she said softly. "The miller's son fought at Saratoga. He'll not turn us away." The thought of those 3 miles nearly undid her. The land was rough, the patrols unpredictable. But there was no turning back now. They moved slowly, stopping often. Isaac's breath rasped, his wound reopening once, leaving dark stains on the cloth Abigail pressed hard against. Twice, distant shouts carried through the trees, and once the glow of torches flickered between trunks only yards away. Abigail pressed Isaac down into a hollow, her own body shielding him as hooves clattered past on the frozen path above. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might betray them, yet the riders thundered on, oblivious. When they rose again, Isaac's strength faltered. "Leave me," he panted. "You can still go back, say you were forced." Abigail tightened her grip on his arm. "If I wanted safety, I'd have left you in the woods to die. But I didn't. Now hush and walk." For a moment he stared at her, then a faint, tired smile tugged at his lips. He said no more. By the time the mill came into view, dawn had begun to bleed into the sky, gray light softening the jagged silhouettes of trees. The old water wheel loomed like a frozen sentinel, the creek beneath it crusted with ice. Abigail felt relief surge so strongly her knees weakened. She half dragged Isaac to the door and knocked with the flat of her hand. "Open cautiously." Samuel Green, the miller's son, stood framed in the doorway, his eyes wary until recognition dawned. "Abby Turner." She nodded, breathless. "We need shelter. Just for a few hours." She shifted so Samuel could see Isaac, sagging against her. "He's a courier. Wounded. If the dragoons find him." Samuel's jaw set. Without another word he stepped aside. "Get him in." The mill smelled of grain and damp wood. Samuel cleared a space behind stacked sacks of flour, spreading a blanket on the floor. Together, he and Abigail eased Isaac down. She checked his bandage again, her hands trembling with exhaustion, but Samuel caught her wrist gently. "You've done more than most men would," he said. She met his gaze, seeing the unspoken admiration there, but shook her head. "I only did what I couldn't not do." Samuel glanced toward the door. "You'd better hide. Patrols came by at dusk, and they'll come again. They think the courier carries something worth a general's pay." Isaac stirred, his voice low but steady. "I do." He gestured toward Abigail, who still carried the satchel. "She's kept it safe. The dispatches must reach Albany. A regiment waits on those orders." Samuel's brow furrowed. "Albany's near 50 miles. Then someone must carry it," Isaac said. His eyes met Abigail's. "If I fall, she knows the path." Abigail blinked, stunned. "Me? You've more courage than you know," Isaac said quietly. The words shook her more than sleet or musket fire ever could. She wanted to protest, to say she was only a farmer's daughter, but the truth was plain. She had carried him this far. She had already chosen. They rested as the sky paled. Samuel tended the mill's wheel while Abigail dozed briefly against a sack of grain, waking each time Isaac coughed. The hours crawled until the crunch of hooves startled them all. Samuel peeked through a shutter, his face grim. "Dragoons. 5 of them." Abigail's blood ran cold. Isaac tried to rise, but the effort left him shaking. Samuel hissed, "Stay hidden." He strode out, wiping his hands on his trousers, as though he had been working since dawn. Through the crack in the shutter, Abigail saw the redcoats dismount. Lieutenant Wallace himself led them, his gaze sharp as a hawk's. "Couriers near," he barked. "We tracked blood to the creek." Samuel forced a laugh. "Only dear blood, Lieutenant. Hunters lost one yesterday." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "We'll see." He motioned, and 2 men strode toward the mill. Abigail's heart slammed. She pressed Isaac's hand, urging him silent, as footsteps thudded closer. The door creaked. A soldier entered, eyes sweeping the sacks. Abigail flattened herself against the grain, praying the shadows held. The man took 2 steps, then 3, his bayonet probing between the stacks. She held her breath until her lungs screamed. Then Samuel's voice called from outside, feigning surprise. "Lieutenant, tracks lead east, toward Cobb's land." The soldier hesitated, glanced back. Wallace's order snapped through the air. "Mount up!" Within moments, the redcoats were gone, hoofbeats fading up the road. Abigail sagged against the grain, every muscle quaking. Samuel slipped back in, his face pale. "That's bought you time no more. They'll circle back." When full daylight came, Abigail knew what she must do. Isaac could not travel farther. Not yet, but the dispatches had to move. She took the satchel, slinging it over her shoulder. Isaac tried to protest, but she silenced him with a firm look. "You trusted me to hide you," she said. "Now trust me to carry this." His gaze softened, heavy with gratitude and worry. He reached, squeezing her hand. "Then God guard your steps, Abigail Turner." She swallowed hard and nodded. The road north was long, but the memory of that dawn carried her. Each mile she walked, she thought of her father's quiet strength, her mother's fear, Thomas's bright eyes. She thought of Isaac, alive because she had refused to turn away. And she thought of the dispatches, folded papers that weighed more than armies. When at last she delivered them, 2 days later, her boots torn, her hands blistered, the officer who received them swore softly and said she had spared hundreds of men from marching blind. He offered her coin, protection, gratitude, but she only shook her head. "Keep your thanks. Just end the war sooner." Weeks later, when Isaac stood once more, mended and whole, he sought her out at the Turner cabin. Snow lay deep, and the hearth was warm. He bowed his head as he spoke. "I am alive because you chose mercy. I will not forget it." Abigail looked at him, at her family gathered safe around the fire, and felt the weight of everything they had endured. The war still raged, but something in her heart had shifted. She was no longer merely a girl gathering kindling in the woods. She had carried a burden greater than herself, and she had not faltered. That winter night, as the wind howled beyond the shutters, Abigail sat by the fire and let the warmth soak into her bones. She thought of choices, of consequences, of the fragile thread between fear and courage. And she knew, whatever came, she would never again doubt her own strength. For when a stranger had fallen bleeding at her feet and begged, "Pray, hide me," she had answered not with fear, but with resolve. And that choice had carried her, had carried them all, into a new dawn.